April 1945. The war in Europe is ending. The Third Reich, once a towering colossus of steel and fury, is crumbling into ash and ruin. Across the shattered landscape of Germany, Allied soldiers march through the rubble of cities, reduced to skeletal silhouettes against smoke-darkened skies. They are liberators, heroes, the men who defeated fascism and freed a continent from the grip of tyranny. But in the quiet spaces between victory parades and newspaper headlines, in the shadows of bombed-out buildings and displaced persons' camps, another story unfolds. A story not of triumph, but of silence. Not of liberation, but of violation. This is the history you were never taught. The chapters torn from textbooks. The testimonies buried in classified files. Today, we uncover what Allied soldiers actually did to German women after victory, and why the armies that claimed to fight for justice worked so hard to hide it. If you're drawn to the forgotten voices of history, to the truths that make us uncomfortable but cannot be ignored, consider subscribing. Because the past is never as simple as the stories we tell ourselves. The spring of 1945 brought no relief to Germany. Only fire, only hunger, only the slow, inevitable collapse of everything familiar. In cities like Berlin, Hamburg, Cologne, the architecture of civilization had been reduced to rubble. Women emerged from cellars where they had hidden for days, sometimes weeks, as artillery shells screamed overhead and buildings folded inward like dying giants. They emerged into a world unrecognizable. A world where the rules had changed. Where survival meant navigating not just the physical dangers of unexploded ordnance and collapsing structures, but the human dangers that walked the streets in Allied uniforms. The official narrative was clear. The Americans, the British, the French, they came as liberators. They brought chocolate and cigarettes. They brought democracy. They brought an end to Nazi terror. And this was true. But it was not the whole truth. Because alongside the rations and the denazification programs and the Marshall Plan, there came something else. Something darker. Something that military authorities would spend decades trying to erase from the historical record. It began quietly. A soldier here, a soldier there. A woman alone in the ruins, scavenging for food. A displaced person, separated from family, without papers, without protection. The encounters were often transactional at first. Food for sex, cigarettes for sex. The occupying armies officially banned what they called fraternization, the mixing of soldiers with German civilians. General Eisenhower himself issued orders forbidding American troops from speaking to Germans beyond official capacity. The penalty for fraternization was court-martial. But orders are only as effective as their enforcement, and in the chaos of occupied Germany, enforcement was uneven at best. By summer of 1945, the fraternization ban had become a joke among the troops. A formality observed in official reports and ignored in practice. American soldiers walked openly with German girlfriends. British troops set up semi-permanent living arrangements with German women in requisitioned homes. The military police looked the other way, overwhelmed by the scale of the violation and perhaps recognizing the futility of enforcing a rule that conflicted so fundamentally with human nature. But not all these relationships were consensual. Not even close. The statistics, when they can be found, tell a story the Allied command desperately wanted suppressed. Between 1945 and 1946, thousands of rape cases involving Allied soldiers and German women were reported to military authorities. Thousands. And these were only the cases that were reported, that made it through the bureaucratic machinery of military justice, that survived the filters of commanding officers who had every incentive to minimize the problem. Historians estimate the actual number was far higher. Some German researchers have suggested tens of thousands of sexual assaults by American and British forces alone during the occupation period. The French colonial troops, particularly those from North Africa, were responsible for mass rapes that German survivors described as systematic and terrifying in their scope. In the American zone, the army did something remarkable and deeply troubling. They held trials, secret trials. Courts-martial for American soldiers accused of raping German women. The army prosecuted these cases with a vigor that seemed, on the surface, to suggest a commitment to justice. Hundreds of soldiers faced charges. Many were convicted. Some were executed. The military justice system functioned, investigated, prosecuted, sentenced. And then, when it was over, when the trials had concluded and the sentences carried out, the files were sealed, classified, buried in archives where they would remain hidden for decades. Why? If the army was prosecuting rapists, if justice was being done, why hide the evidence? The answer reveals something profound about the nature of historical memory and the construction of national narratives. The United States had just fought a war against an ideology it characterized as fundamentally evil. American soldiers were the good guys, the liberators, the moral victors in a cosmic struggle between democracy and fascism. The existence of widespread sexual violence by American troops against German civilians complicated that narrative beyond repair. It suggested that perhaps the line between good and evil was not as clear as the propaganda posters claimed. That perhaps soldiers of all armies, when placed in conditions of absolute power over helpless populations, were capable of monstrous acts. The trials themselves followed a pattern. A German woman, often young, often alone, would report being raped by an American soldier or soldiers. Military police would investigate. If the case seemed credible, if there was evidence, if the woman was willing to testify despite the social stigma and the potential retribution, the accused would face court-martial. The proceedings were swift. Military justice moved faster than civilian courts, unencumbered by many of the protections defendants enjoyed in American criminal law. Conviction rates were high. Sentences were harsh. The army wanted to send a message to the troops that rape would not be tolerated. But they also wanted to ensure that this message remained internal, a matter of military discipline rather than public scandal. Some of the convicted men were executed, hanged or shot by firing squad in military prisons across occupied Germany. Others received long sentences at hard labor, decades in military stockades. The punishments were severe by any standard, harsher than many American soldiers would have received for similar crimes committed against American women back home. But the executions and imprisonments happened quietly, without press coverage, without public acknowledgement. The families of the executed soldiers were told their sons or husbands or brothers had been convicted of crimes. But the details were vague, the charges sanitized in official notifications. The women who testified at these trials showed extraordinary courage. To come forward as a German woman in 1945 or 1946, to accuse an American soldier of rape, meant exposing yourself to accusations of collaboration, of promiscuity, of lying to protect your reputation. German communities were often hostile to rape victims, viewing them as having brought shame on themselves or as having engaged in consensual relationships they later regretted. The military authorities were skeptical, trained to suspect that German women might make false accusations to get soldiers in trouble or to extract compensation. To navigate this gauntlet and still insist on justice required a kind of strength that history has largely forgotten. And what of the soldiers who were never caught? The vast majority of sexual assaults went unreported, uninvestigated, unpunished. A woman raped in a bombed-out building by soldiers who moved on to the next town. A displaced person assaulted in a refugee camp where chaos and desperation made any form of order impossible. The women who traded sex for food because the alternative was starvation, transactions that existed in a moral gray zone between consent and coercion. These victims had no trials, no justice, no acknowledgement. They survived, or they didn't, and their stories disappeared into the vast silence that surrounds the experiences of civilian women in war. The French zone presented its own horrors. French colonial troops, recruited from Algeria, Morocco, Senegal, and Indochina, participated in the occupation of southwestern Germany. The French military employed these troops extensively in combat and occupation roles, and their conduct toward German civilians was markedly different from their European counterparts. Reports from German survivors describe mass rapes by French colonial soldiers, attacks that were organized and sustained rather than opportunistic. In some towns, women were rounded up and assaulted in groups. The French military command initially dismissed these reports as German propaganda, as attempts to divide the Allied coalition by playing on racist fears of African soldiers. But as the evidence accumulated, as testimonies multiplied, the French authorities could no longer deny the pattern. The French response was complicated by colonial politics. To prosecute North African soldiers for raping German women would have required acknowledging that these troops, drawn from populations the French themselves colonized and oppressed, had committed atrocities under French command. It would have raised uncomfortable questions about the treatment of colonial subjects, about the double standards applied to different populations within the empire. So the French, like the Americans and British, opted for silence. Some prosecutions occurred, some punishment was meted out, but the full scale of the violence was never officially acknowledged. The British zone saw fewer reported cases, though whether this reflected actual differences in soldier conduct or merely differences in reporting mechanisms remains debated by historians. The British military was perhaps more successful at maintaining discipline, or perhaps British soldiers were more discreet, or perhaps German women in the British zone were less willing to report assaults to authorities. The evidence is incomplete, the records fragmentary. What is clear is that sexual violence was not limited to any single Allied nation, any single army. It was a systemic problem, a predictable outcome when young men with weapons exercised power over a defeated population. By 1946, as the immediate chaos of the German collapse began to give way to the more organized phase of occupation, the Allied authorities made a conscious decision. The rape trials would continue, but they would remain secret. The convictions and executions would proceed, but without public acknowledgement. The message to the troops would be clear: rape is unacceptable, but the message to the world would be silence. The liberation narrative must remain intact. The moral superiority of the Allied cause could not be complicated by widespread acknowledgement that liberators had also been perpetrators. The women themselves faced a peculiar form of erasure. In the immediate post-war period, German society was consumed with its own survival, with rebuilding, with processing the trauma of defeat and the revelations of Nazi crimes. The suffering of German women at the hands of Allied soldiers was acknowledged in whispers, in private conversations, but rarely in public discourse. To speak of it was to risk being accused of minimizing German war crimes, of engaging in moral equivalence, of suggesting that the victims of Nazism and the perpetrators were somehow equally guilty. This was not true, and most German rape survivors understood the distinction. They knew that German armies had committed atrocities across Europe, that German occupation had brought unimaginable suffering to millions. But this knowledge did not erase their own trauma, their own violation, their own right to acknowledgement and justice. The children born of these assaults grew up in a Germany that did not want to remember them. Thousands of babies conceived through rape by Allied soldiers, children who carried no responsibility for the circumstances of their conception but who bore the social stigma nonetheless. Some were raised by their mothers, who did their best to provide love and stability despite the circumstances. Others were given up for adoption, placed in orphanages, sent away to spare the family shame. Many of these children spent their lives wondering about their fathers, about the soldiers whose names they would never know, whose faces they would never see. They were living reminders of a chapter of history both sides wanted to forget. The classified files began to emerge decades later, slowly, reluctantly. Historians working in military archives in the 1980s and 1990s started to piece together the scope of the suppressed rape trials. They found court-martial records, conviction statistics, execution orders. They found testimony from German women describing assaults in devastating detail. They found correspondence between military commanders discussing how to handle the public relations problem of soldiers on trial for rape. The picture that emerged was of a military establishment that took sexual violence seriously enough to prosecute it but not seriously enough to acknowledge it publicly. Justice of a sort was done in individual cases, but accountability, historical accountability, was avoided. The question that haunts this history is not whether individual soldiers were punished. Many were. The question is why the broader truth was suppressed, why the American and British and French publics were never told the full story, why the liberation narrative was preserved at the cost of honesty. And the answer, uncomfortable as it may be, is that nations at war require simple stories. They require heroes and villains, good guys and bad guys, moral clarity in a morally complex world. To admit that liberators also committed atrocities, that the line between savior and predator could blur, that victory did not automatically confer moral purity, was to undermine the entire ideological foundation of the war effort. This is not to suggest moral equivalence with Nazi crimes. The Holocaust was an industrial genocide, a systematic attempt to exterminate entire populations. The Nazi occupation of Europe brought deliberate, organized, state-sponsored atrocities on a scale almost beyond comprehension. The sexual violence committed by Allied soldiers in occupied Germany was neither systematic nor state-sponsored. It was not policy. It was not organized. It was individual soldiers or small groups of soldiers committing crimes that their own military authorities prosecuted when discovered. But it happened. It happened far more often than the official histories acknowledge. And the victims deserved then, and deserve now, to have their experiences recognized as part of the historical record. The women who survived carried their trauma in silence for decades. Some never spoke of it, not to their husbands, not to their children, not even to themselves in the privacy of their own thoughts. The shame was too great, the social consequences too severe, the risk of being disbelieved too high. Others spoke in their final years in oral history projects, in interviews with researchers who promised confidentiality. Their testimonies, recorded on tape or transcribed in academic journals, provide a window into experiences that official documents sanitized or erased entirely. They speak of the terror of hearing boots on the stairs, of hiding in cellars while soldiers searched houses, of the moment when resistance became impossible, of the aftermath, the bleeding, the pregnancy scares, the diseases, the nightmares that persisted for decades. And they speak of the betrayal, not just the betrayal of the assault itself, but the betrayal of silence. The betrayal of a world that celebrated their liberators while ignoring what liberation had cost them. The betrayal of historians who wrote triumphant accounts of Allied victory without mentioning the price paid by civilian women. The betrayal of governments that classified the evidence, that chose narrative over truth, that decided some victims mattered less than others. This is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of military occupation, any military occupation in any war. When one army defeats another and occupies its territory, the soldiers of the occupying army exercise power over a helpless civilian population. And some of those soldiers, freed from normal social constraints, separated from families and communities that might moderate their behavior, given authority and weapons and opportunity, will abuse that power. This was true of the Romans in Gaul, of the Mongols in China, of the Spanish in Mexico, of the Germans in Poland, of the Soviets in Germany, and yes, of the Americans and British and French in Germany. It is a pattern as old as warfare itself, a dark constant in the human experience of conflict. The Soviet occupation of Eastern Germany was far worse in scale. This is well documented, acknowledged even by Russian historians in the post-Soviet era. Soviet soldiers raped German women in numbers that may have reached into the hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions. The violence was more systematic, more widespread, more openly tolerated by Soviet military authorities. German women in the Soviet zone lived in constant terror, developed elaborate strategies for hiding, for making themselves unattractive, for feigning illness or insanity. The Western Allies pointed to Soviet atrocities as evidence of their own moral superiority, and in comparative terms, they were not wrong. But comparison is not exoneration. That Soviet crimes were greater does not erase American, British, and French crimes. It does not restore the dignity of women assaulted by soldiers wearing uniforms of democratic nations. The files remain partially classified even today. Researchers seeking access to complete records of the rape trials face bureaucratic obstacles, privacy concerns, claims of national security. The archives release documents slowly, selectively, with redactions. We may never know the full scope of the sexual violence in occupied Germany. We may never have a complete accounting of victims, of perpetrators, of trials and convictions and punishments. The history will remain fragmentary, constructed from survivor testimony, military records released after decades of classification, newspaper reports from German sources that Allied authorities dismissed as propaganda. But what we know is enough. Enough to understand that the liberation of Germany was not a simple moral tale. Enough to recognize that victory in war does not automatically confer virtue on the victors. Enough to insist that historical memory include the voices of women whose suffering was deemed inconvenient to the national narrative. These women were victims of Nazi aggression, victims of war, and victims of the men who came to liberate them. Their stories belong in the history books, not in classified files gathering dust in military archives. There is a painful irony in the fact that the nations that prosecuted Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg, that established principles of individual accountability for atrocities committed during war, simultaneously suppressed evidence of crimes committed by their own soldiers. The Nuremberg trials declared that following orders was not an excuse, that soldiers had a moral obligation to refuse illegal commands, that crimes against civilians would be punished regardless of the uniform worn by the perpetrator. These were revolutionary principles, the foundation of modern international humanitarian law. But they were applied selectively. German soldiers who raped and murdered faced justice. Allied soldiers who did the same often escaped accountability, shielded by military authorities who feared the public relations consequences of admission. The women who testified at the secret courts martial believed they were participating in a process that would bring justice. Many were shocked to learn, years or decades later, that the trials had been classified, that their testimony would never be part of the public record, that their suffering had been deemed a state secret. They had found the courage to speak, to relive their trauma in front of military judges, and their reward was continued silence. Not the silence of personal choice, of privacy voluntarily maintained, but the imposed silence of state secrecy, of documents locked away, of histories unwritten. And so we return to April 1945, to the moment when Allied soldiers marched through the rubble of German cities as liberators and conquerors both. We return with different eyes now, eyes that have seen the classified files, read the testimony, counted the convictions, measured the silence. The liberation was real. The defeat of Nazism was necessary and just. But liberation does not erase assault. Victory does not excuse rape. And the soldiers who committed these crimes, and the authorities who hid them, diminished the very cause they claimed to fight for. History is not comfortable. It should not be. The past contains horrors that challenge our need for simple narratives, for clear heroes, for moral certainty. The Allied soldiers who liberated concentration camps, who freed Europe from fascist tyranny, were the same soldiers who, in some cases, assaulted German women in occupied cities. Both things are true. Both belong in the history we tell ourselves. To acknowledge this is not to equate Allied democracies with Nazi Germany. It is to recognize that war corrupts, that power without accountability leads to abuse, that even just causes can be stained by unjust acts. The women whose voices were silenced deserve better. They deserved justice in 1945. They deserved acknowledgement in the decades that followed. They deserve, at minimum, to be remembered now, not as footnotes or statistical anomalies, but as human beings whose suffering mattered, whose testimony matters, whose lives were forever altered by encounters with soldiers they had been told would bring them freedom. Their stories complicate the liberation narrative, but history is complicated. Truth is complicated. And if we cannot face the complicated truth, then we are not remembering history at all. We are merely reciting mythology. The spring of 1945 brought no relief to Germany. Only fire, only hunger, only the slow, inevitable collapse of everything familiar. And in the shadows of that collapse, In the spaces between official reports and public celebrations, women suffered violations that their liberators worked hard to hide, to minimize, to erase from the record. But erasure is not the same as forgetting. The survivors remember, their children remember, and now perhaps we can remember too. Not to diminish the Allied victory, but to honor it honestly. To say that yes, we defeated fascism, and yes, some of our soldiers committed crimes, and yes, we owe it to the victims to acknowledge both truths. This is the history they hid, the trials they suppressed, the voices they silenced. And this is why we must speak now, decades later, even when it makes us uncomfortable. Especially when it makes us uncomfortable. Because the women in the ruins deserved better than silence then, and they deserve better than silence now.